And on the morrow they returned to the castle, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. When the governor had read the letter, it's like a cover letter explaining why Paul was there. When the governor had read the letter, he asked what province he was, and when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he said, I'll hear thee when your accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So these Jews have accused Paul of sedition and heresy and inciting riots and a lot of false charges against him. And just like in a jury trial, or in a trial, they're not going to have a trial with Paul without his accusers being there. So now we go into chapter 24. Good morning, Sister Nancy. Glad you're here. Very glad. Brother Tim, you've got the mic. If you'll start reading in, and this is amazing. When the Jews come, they don't just come. They have a paid, really a shill. They have this guy that's like a professional speaker. And he's smooth with his language and good with his words. And they bring this guy with them to kind of tilt the balance. You know, if you got a balance, they're putting their hand on it to try to do it like this. All right, Brother Tim, Acts chapter 24, the first verse.
And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing...
Yeah, before we even read this, let's just back up a second. Ananias the high priest, if y'all remember him from the previous chapter, he's the one that when Paul, speaking to the council, said, I stand here in good conscience, and Ananias commanded those that stood by to smite Paul on the cheek. This is the same dirty high priest. And then, as Tim reads this second verse, this guy Tertullus, or however you pronounce his name, listen to how smooth, how he's buttering up, and just, he's a jerk, really. Go ahead, Tim.
So we stopped at...
verse 2.
Yeah. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by the providence. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words.
Man, what a bunch of garbage. This Acts chapter 24. And Tim just read through the fourth verse. He's just just schmoozing up to this guy, you know. Keep going, Tim.
For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so.
Stop right there. So here he's just a bunch of, verse 5. We found him a pestilent fellow. The word pestilent. We need Daryl here for the word. What does pestilent mean? Yeah, pest being the key word. Pest is a little nicer than pest, isn't it? So pest being the root word there. So we found this guy a thorn in our side, basically, right? Okay, and we found him a mover of sedition. What does the word sedition mean? Just tell me. Okay. Sedition, without looking it up, just means unrest, I think. Basically, so he's a mover of unrest. He's creating tumult in the people.
Problems.
Yeah. And he's a ringleader of the sect. Sect is a group of the Nazarenes, which is a compliment to Paul, because Paul was not from Nazareth at all. He was from Jerusalem. But Jesus was from Nazareth and was known as a Nazarene. So any follower of Christ in that day was labeled a Nazarene, even though they weren't from there. So really that was a compliment to be connected that way. And
this shows you, it says that he was orator. He was a man trained in
he was
speech.
a professional
He was a
speaker.
professional speaker.
That's exactly right.
And you can tell how skilled he is. He's insulted Paul 3 times in one sentence.
Well,
it's not an insult from our
before that,
perspective.
He had kissed up.
Right. He flattered
obnoxiously.
his audience, and then he begins by just slamming Paul 3 times in one sentence. I mean, that's slick.
It's kind of like
This is a
when you
slick
go
fella.
to court now, they allow you to bring in professionals,
Experts.
expert witnesses. I have a friend that I know through guitar and music, lives in North Carolina, and he flies around the country, and his expertise is in reconstructing accidents, vehicular accidents. So he goes to the site and measures the skid marks and the angle something hit, and it's way above my head. I don't know how he does what he does, but he is called in, my friend, as an expert witness. Mike Maddox is his name, all over the country. He's a guru in that. They'll bring in, it's a murder trial. They're going to bring in an expert on blood splatter and all that kind of stuff.
But it's interesting you brought that up, because one of the issues that courts have with experts is that the prosecution can get an expert, but so can the defense, and they can have 2 different conclusions.
Right.
And you don't know which one to trust. And in the trial with Jesus, one of the issues was that they called false witnesses against him.
That's correct.
They were witnesses in a court trial who lied. Well, this man is doing the same kind of stuff. He's an expert, quote unquote, but he's painting Paul in a bad light.
A lot of times their testimony is tainted by who is paying them.
Right, exactly.
So
Exactly.
this
So this
guy's
man is hired by the Jews.
really, 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 really good. But Paul is standing here by himself. He has no paid orators. He has no expert witnesses.
Right.
But he also is extremely skilled in debate and in words. And we're going to find that out, because he can stand here by himself. And another thing, too, there's nothing when you come to talking about defending yourself, there's the best defense always is if you're standing on truth.
Right.
There's something in your words of conviction. You can feel the conviction of a person telling the truth. You can have 2 children and they are upset, and one's got a story and another's got a story. Y'all are veterans of this by now, the 2 young couples sitting here. But you can kind of almost tell just by the timbre of their voice who's telling the truth, right? Because there's something, I know I didn't do it.
Right.
So Paul is going to stand on truth. Sister Nancy, I believe you got the mic. And let's pick up, we're in Acts 24, if anybody just logged in on the web, and we're in the 10th verse.
Then Paul, after the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogue, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way, which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself, to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. Whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. Or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be for one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day.
Wow, that's a pretty good defense.
Very good.
He's two different times in this one speech, if you want to call it that, in two different times he has gone through the details that he's innocent. He said in the 12th verse, they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man. They did not find me raising up the people, meaning in tumult, neither in the synagogue or in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. Then the second time he says, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. And they ought to be here. If they got anything against me, they ought to be here. So it's a pretty strong. Now, so he kind of destroys Tertullus's false accusations twice, the paid orator. And then at the same time, though, he has the boldness that he says in verse 13, that I have hope toward God, which the Jews also allow, the Pharisees did, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. He touches on that again in the last verse, 21st verse that Nancy read. Except for it be this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day.
These guys were accusing you. They're like the lawyer or the Pharisees, law, right?
Correct.
I'm wondering how many of those guys were actually his friends when he was on their side. Yeah, good question.
Well, they agreed and yet they didn't agree. And this is a critical point. They believed in the general idea of the resurrection of the dead. But they didn't believe Christ had raised, not the Pharisees. They were totally opposed to that. But see, that's where them and Paul was, and he knew that. Paul knew that. When he stood a couple of days before this, when he realized there were Sadducees and Pharisees in the council, and he said, the hope of the resurrection of the dead am I called into question. He knew what he was doing. He knew the Pharisees believed in the philosophy, but they didn't believe that applied to Jesus. It's kind of like, and I don't say this to sound negative or slam anybody, but I think it's true. It's kind of like we can agree that someone is a Christian. Many friends and people we know that they believe in the ideal. But do they believe of what the resurrection of the dead was about? That it can make us brand new and clean. That's where we part from most quote unquote Christians. They believe in the general idea. They don't believe in the specific. That it can make us, as I mentioned last week, when I met that couple, I think it was last Thursday or Friday, for the second time, and they had found out our church name in my first visit, and I'd already forgot about it. And the lady said, I want to ask you, we're talking about windows. They got rotting windows. We're talking about windows for 10 minutes. Now the woman, she says, can I ask you a question? She'd already asked. I'm thinking it's a window question, right? She says, are you sanctified and holy? Because that statement is not, you're not going to run into many people that'll say, I am sanctified and holy. You know, that's just, that we believe in, but not here.
Humans are weird because we,
Yes, you are.
I said humans. And I recognize that. We have to have things in a box for us to mentally accept some things, you know, and if people don't conform to the boxes I have available in my mind.
We all have boxes.
We all have boxes. And if you don't conform to a particular box that I have in my mind so that I can categorize you in my mind, then I have a hard time accepting that, right? And that's why you have in society, you have people who are kind of outcast a little bit because they don't conform to anybody's boxes. And
That's true.
there would be, in our society, there would be a persecution of certain kinds of Christians, us included, I believe, if the church and state were connected. But we don't connect it in America. But in this day and time, even though the Romans didn't believe in Judaism, they didn't believe in religions of places that they conquered, they let those folks have control and use the law to force people into a box. And the Christians did not fit into the Jews' box. They had a general agreement of certain things, but it didn't fit the Pharisees' box. And that was part of the issue that Jesus preached against the Pharisees. Was he said, your box is illegitimate. You're trying to fit Judaism, fit the Hebrew law into this thing. And he says it's more than that. It's more than you following all these laws to the jot and the tittle and all this. He said you've got to fulfill it in your heart. And they, in their sinful pride, refused to accept the truth of that word. And Jesus prophesied that if you walk away from truth, that it would cause you to be even more hateful, more opposed, I guess is the right word, to truth. And so, these men here, they cannot just accept Paul and the small group of Christians existing. They want to totally and completely blot them out, shut them up, refuse to let them continue.
Well, they said at one point, they said the whole world has gone after this thought.
Yeah.
That was about Jesus. And they recognized that when they thought that they had done away with Jesus, and now it's kind of like they teach firefighters when they go to put out a fire, you've got to be there till the ashes are all out. You can't leave anything that would flame back up.
Yeah.
And Paul and his group, in their mind, this fire was catching on again, and it was a threat. And there was a real interesting dynamic at that moment in history where the Romans had the military power and the legal power to control these provinces. And they had a system set up of government. We're going to read about this in just a minute. We're getting ready to. Paul now is testifying before the governor of a certain district, Felix. Felix was only there for about 3 years. Then he was replaced, we're going to read in the beginning of the 25th chapter, he was replaced by a man named Festus. Kind of like when we vote on governors, presidents, they're there for a while, then they're replaced. So this is kind of the same. So you had that, you've got the Romans kind of they've got the military power, they've got the legal power, but yet you've got the Jewish people that's under the Roman rule, and they've got the religious power. And there's a dynamic there, and they have to deal with each other, the Romans and the Jews. The Romans can't just do what they want and not have, because the Jews had money. The tax money and stuff like that was coming from a majority of the Jews. So there was an interesting dynamic in history of how they had to deal with each other. Wow. Yes, Sister Nancy, pass the mic.
One, Paul mentions that way twice in this chapter.
Yeah.
But he's mentioned it other, and as far as I know, he's the only one, and in Acts, that talks about the way or that way.
How about that?
And he wants to let them know that there is a way there
Yes.
that he is following.
Yes.
He's going that way. And it reminded me of the verse that a way shall be there,
Yes.
and it shall be a highway.
Yes.
And that's the way.
Yes.
The early church were called people of the way. That's what they referred to them as, people of the way. And Paul's stressing that. And I had another thought too. You talking about your couple. Do you remember Miss Louise Darden in Barden? That's right, in Jemison. Right.
Yeah.
Well, for years there was no church there, of course, and so she went to church with her daughter. She said that didn't make a bit of difference to me. I won't name the kind of church. She said I testified every time I got a chance that I was a sanctified woman and what that stood for. So I thought, you can be a witness anywhere that you go. You can be a witness in another place if you happen not to have a place to go. You can be a witness there. And boy, when the Sanctified Church came back, of course, she was so tickled to have a church to come to that she could be free. But she said, I didn't mince words with those people. And, I just thought, I wondered about your couple in that if they were in a different church, could they testify and could they be a witness?
Well,
and of course they can.
They live in our neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
They live in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they're an older couple. He's a retired football coach. He actually coached in high school in Thomas County. There was a football player named Charlie Ward that won the Heisman Trophy in 1992. And he was his football coach. But they're a very sweet couple. He conducts a men's Bible study on Friday mornings, I think, with some men, retired guys in his church. He's got a sweet spirit, and she said when she asked that question to me, "Are you sanctified and holy?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She said, "We are too." How about that?
Yeah.
And that's not something you're going to hear. And I don't. I imagine most of y'all can relate to what I'm getting ready to say. I've had a couple people, more than a couple, maybe in business or whatever, through conversation, and they'll find out that I'm connected here, and or maybe somebody said something to them. "Oh, you didn't tell me you was a preacher," whatever. And I tell them I don't wear that on my sleeve. I don't go around telling people say that. I don't go around saying I'm a sanctified man, because that brings attention to me, and I'm not comfortable with that at all. I'd rather, as Jesus said, let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. I'd rather them ask a question. I pray about this, y'all. And it's not hard because I got Jesus in me. But if I get Gary out of the way, Jesus in me will do the work. I want my life to be a statement. Things go, I know with anybody's work, a lot of whatever you do, Jesse can relate to this, and I know probably everybody can. a lot of whatever we do is not connected necessarily with what we do as much as we're putting out fires when things go wrong. I mean, it doesn't matter what you do for a living. There's things go backwards, customers get upset. And so, I mean, that's just the nature of any business, and you've got to deal with that. And so how do you react when the fires are burning bright? Now, here in what we just read, that stands out to me in Paul's defense is that even though he's deflecting what this paid orator has said, and he does it well, and he does it twice, he also has the boldness. He's not going to back down from why he's really there. Why he's really there is because he is one of those Nazarenes, because he is a believer in the way, because he is standing on the living resurrection of the dead, believing that Christ raised from the dead. That's the real reason that they're mad at, and the real reason that he's there. And he didn't back down from that. And I love that part about him. Because, as Brother Johnny preached to us on Easter Sunday, how you believe about the resurrection of Christ is the difference maker in your personal life. If you've accepted it and you want to be a part of it, that resurrection will change you, because you will be raised a new person. And I mean, at the end, and this has been going on in my mind for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and this is not a new revelation at all. I'm not even pretending that it is. It's one of those simple truths that just matter. There's only going to be one of two gods controlling your heart. Either it's God himself or it's you. Either. Because if God's not in your heart, then what you've told him is that I want to be God. I want to make my decisions. And that's really what Paul's talking about here. It's all keyed on the resurrection of the dead. You can't have resurrection until you have died. And then Christ can be raised in you. Let's go to what Felix says next. You can pass the mic back. And let's start reading in verse 22 and read through the end of the chapter.
22.
Uh-huh.
And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or to come unto him. And after certain days, when Felix with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul. When Felix came with his wife Drusilla, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him.
That's the only time that word's in the Bible. Oftener.
Sounds like somebody who don't know the English language trying to...
To the fullness.
Yeah, right. Oftener.
To the fullness.
And communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to shew the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound.
Let's decipher that last verse. Porcius Festus came into Felix, not the room, but he came in to his office. He took over, is what it's talking about. I'm assuming that Felix, they had an office.
Yeah, they rotated governors.
Like a governor would, he's got an office, right? Somewhere in the State House. So he came in and took over, not the room, but that office. And then, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, he left Paul bound. Not bound this way, but meaning that he was under the care of a centurion. He had already said in verse 23, he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty. But he was bound because the centurion was always around. That's what it's talking about here. Just want to kind of, because that verse sounds like he's in like this. And it sounds like Felix come in the room, and if you just take it at face value. Now, Felix had a Jewish wife, a Roman governor. So you see how the Romans and Jews, they were not the same, and yet they were connected.
Right.
They were tied together. And his wife was Jewish. So he had understanding of how Paul was raised, a little more understanding than maybe most Roman governors did. That puts an interesting twist to it. It says that as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. Let me read you a verse in the 16th chapter of John. I had this marked in my Bible a long time ago. This is Jesus talking. John 16, verse 7. Nevertheless, I tell you the truth, it's expedient or necessary for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Comforter will not come unto you. But if I depart, I'll send him unto you. Now this verse, tying into what we just read in verse 23. We just read in verse 23 that Felix reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. What does Jesus say about the Holy Ghost? And when he is come, he will reprove the world of sin, of righteousness, and of judgment. Man, those two verses are completely tied together. They are. And of sin, because they believe not on me. Of righteousness, because I go to my Father, you see me no more. Of judgment, because the prince of this world, who is that? Satan. The prince of this world is judged. So Felix is reasoning with these things.
I think that's saying that Paul reasoned and that Felix trembled at that reason.
Okay? Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it said he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ
Right.
as he reasoned.
As he reasoned. So he's talking to Felix.
And this goes back to the way Paul operated. Paul was so skilled at talking to his audience.
She's messing with that bug bait. Not now. She's good. She's good.
He talked to his audience. And it says in some places that he disputed with them out of the scriptures.
Right.
Which indicates a more combative debate. Because some people, when they heard him, they resisted the preaching of the truth. But with others, it says that he reasoned with them out of the scriptures. And God is so gracious to allow us to ask questions. Because he wants us to come to a knowledge of the truth. Jesus did that. With some, he reasoned with them, he explained, he told parables, he talked to them. When when Nicodemus came to him by night, he didn't reject Nicodemus out of hand for questioning how, being born again should take place. But he explained it to him. And then there were others where he didn't say a word because he knew they were already resistant in their heart. And Paul, I think, saw that Felix had a tender heart. Felix didn't give in. How many people have we seen like that? They tremble when they hear the truth. They weep openly in conviction. They want to keep talking about it. It says that he brought him back oftener.
Well,
he talked to him a lot over 2 years.
He also had an ulterior motive.
Oh, sure. He wanted money.
He wanted to be bribed and to release him. And what's interesting in all of this, we'll get into the minutia of each chapter, and there's the details of this part of the story. But the big picture is that Paul is ultimately going to speak to Caesar. Now, unfortunately for us, we don't have a record of that encounter. Man, don't you know? I would love to read what happened when he finally got to Caesar. Oh my goodness. But here he's kind of like working his way up the ladder, going to the emperor.
Yeah. Well, it's like a court case going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It takes years to get there.
Because he starts with the mob, where it started down at the ground level. Then he goes to the local council. Now he's with the governor. He's getting ready to,
Go to another governor. Go before another
yeah,
governor.
he's going to talk to Festus, and then he goes to the king, Agrippa. And Agrippa's under the emperor Caesar. So we follow this story in Acts from the ground when he's talking to the mob, and he just goes all, and we get up to Agrippa. We're going to read that probably in a week or two, where he's talking to the king. But ultimately, he's going to talk to Caesar, the emperor. We don't have a record of that in the book of Acts. Man.
But I think it stands to reason, because we do have a record of everything he said to every level of official. I think it stands to reason that his answer was not very different.
Oh, no. I
Yeah.
know what he said was the same. Now, here's the other interesting thing. From the time he spoke to the mob and spoke to the council and gets to Felix is 12 days. That's pretty fast. 2 weeks. Basically, weekend to the
Yep.
second weekend. 12 days. But notice this last verse that we just read in chapter 24. But after 2 years, Festus is elected or nominated or voted or
He's appointed.
appointed,
He's
whoever,
appointed.
however he gets there after 2. So we go from 12 days where we got this furor of all this stuff happening. There's 3 big meetings in 12 days, and now there's 2 years goes by till the next appointment. And the rest of this story, even though it's packed into a few chapters, is over the span of about, I don't know, 6 or 8 years maybe. It's a long time. And he ends up in the book of Acts that Paul's under house arrest at the end of the very last chapter of the book of Acts. And he's allowed to talk to people that come in and out of his house. But he's under house arrest at the very end of this book. Wow, my goodness. The 25th verse is a sermon?
Because
Yes.
Felix, he was under conviction. He was trembling.
Yeah.
He was trembling. He knew the truth when he heard it. And yet he said, go thy way.
Yeah.
And I think about people that we talk to about their soul. They'll say things like, well, if I felt something, I would come. Or they say something like, well, I'm thinking about it. You know, anything to get you away from them so they don't have to make a decision. And he didn't want to make a decision. And so he said, just go that way. I'll talk to you some more. Well, he did, but he still didn't make a decision.
Making the decision is uncomfortable, isn't it? But really, I'm really saying for any person at wherever we're at in life, making that decision is uncomfortable because making that decision upends the life that we know. And it puts us into the unknown, the future. We don't know how it's going to impact us going forward. Talked to people in the benches for a long time, and I've heard all kinds of answers. I remember the night in 2004 at Saturday night of the Atlanta Feast meeting. Sister Sandy had gone to the altar in 2003 at the Atlanta Feast meeting and became sanctified. And so it was a big weekend for her first anniversary, her first year of being sanctified. And her mother and father were there, Fred and Louise. And I went back and was talking to Louise, and I'm saying this like I can't put any spin on this. This is I was shocked when she said yes. I was shocked. This woman had been saved for 40 years. And she was so frail. I literally escorted her like I escort Carolyn. I escorted her as the greatest escort I've ever done. I got chills talking about going down the aisle. Sandy was standing, this is a story now. Sandy's standing like this right here. And I told her later I wanted to go, Sandy! You know, I couldn't do that, of course. But I remember thinking when I got home that night, and this was not a vain thought. This was from my heart. I'm going to remember what I said to her because I want to use that with somebody else for the Lord's sake. And do you know, I got up the next morning and to this day, I could not tell you 2 words I said to that woman. The Lord wiped it from my mind. There is no blanket.
Yeah, there's no template.
There's no template. There's no blanket statement because will that work with her? Well, then I'm going to use it with this one. And I mean, I meant that in the right way. I want to find the key to the lock. I want the whole world to come to Christ. But the Lord taught me a lesson. Because everybody is in a different place. Right. Everybody's in a different place. Let's stop. We're going to stop right here, and we'll pick up at the beginning of chapter 25 next week. And so for those on the web, we'll be having church in just a few minutes. Yes, sir. Well, we got a whole plan. Hey, lady.